Today we're going to talk about the nervous system, which is from Chapter 2 in your book, Neuroscience and Behavior. The nervous system completely controls everything we do. The complex behavior of the nervous system is fundamentally, therefore, biological. So everything psychological at its root is biological. However, we're a long way from connecting thoughts, behaviors, and feelings to specific and discrete biological events in the brain. And it's going to be a long time before we can do that. So psychology right now is a very exciting field because of the advances in neuroscience. The nervous system consists of all the nerve cells in your body. It's the body's speedy electrochemical communication system. It really consists of two major groupings: the central nervous system, which is comprised of the brain and the spinal cord. And we have the peripheral nervous system, and those consist of all the sensory and motor neurons that connect the central nervous system to the rest of your body. And here's what it looks like. On the left we have in red the brain and spinal column, and that we call the central nervous system. And on the right we have the peripheral nervous system. Those are all the sensory and motor neurons that go throughout your whole body. We're now going to look at a further subdivision of the nervous system. As the slide before said, we divide the nervous system into peripheral and central. We're now going to subdivide the peripheral into several subdivisions. The major subdivision are the autonomic and somatic peripheral systems. The autonomic system controls all the self-regulated action of internal organs and glands. Right now, your autonomic nervous system is controlling your breathing for you. The somatic system controls the voluntary movements of muscles. So if you wanted to raise your hand, it is that part of the peripheral system that would actually control it. Now, the autonomic system itself, however, has a really interesting subdivision, and we divide it into two further parts: the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. The sympathetic nervous system was designed to get you up for battle. It's an arousing system. It allows adrenaline and other kinds of compounds to actually get you ready to flee or to fight. You get sympathetic nervous system arousal when you get ready to take a test, or perhaps just before an athletic contest. It gets your muscles ready to actually operate more efficiently, and it makes you ready to fight or to flee. You can't stay in this state forever, and so in order to restore calm to your body, we have the parasympathetic nervous system. And this involves getting you away from the high aroused state of the sympathetic nervous system and restoring you to sort of normal, everyday calm. You need to keep in mind that there are different kinds of neurons. We divide the world into sensory neurons, which carry incoming information from your sense receptors to the central nervous system. And in fact, every time you touch something, that message gets carried up through sensory neurons to your brain. Motor neurons carry outgoing information from the central nervous system to your muscles and glands. Interneurons connect the two neurons, and in fact are very important for complexity of our nervous system. We have a few million sensory neurons, likewise a few million motor neurons. However, we have billions of interneurons. All of the cells of your spinal column and all of the cells of your brain are in fact interneurons. I wouldn't pay too much attention to these schematic drawings of the different kinds of nerve cells, but just keep in mind that they are distinct and have different jobs to do. We didn't always think about the mind as being comprised of neurons. In fact, there are some ancient conceptions of the mind that we need to keep in mind. Plato correctly placed the mind in the brain. Oddly, his student Aristotle believed that the mind was located in the heart. Both of them, however, thought of the mind as being something quite separate from the body. And here's a picture of the teacher and the student. Today, however, we believe that mind and brain are faces of the same coin. That is, everything that is psychological is simultaneously biological. Someday we hope to know how those are all connected. But 200 years ago, the history of mind took an interesting turn. By this time, everybody agreed that the mind resided in the head, and a field called phrenology got started. And we credit a man named Franz Gall, who suggested that bumps on the skull represented mental abilities. His theory, although very incorrect, nevertheless proposed that different mental abilities were modular, that is, special parts of the brain specialized in certain activities or abilities. He constructed very elaborate models of the brain based on the bumps, or in some cases, the hollows of your skull. If you look very closely, he was actually quite specific about where he thought things were. If you wanted to know where hope lay, then it was up in the top of your skull. Destructiveness appears to be wrapped around your ear, and so on. Although he was completely wrong about all of these things, he did establish the idea that parts of the brain specialized in certain activities. For example, the back of your head is clearly involved in processing visual information, and we'll explore these kinds of things in much more detail later. We're now going to talk about neural communication. The body's information system is built from billions of interconnected cells, which are called neurons. Oddly, these connections among neurons are not direct and physical, the way you would have an electrical system, but via a chemical connection across a small gap. Neighboring neurons send chemical signals called neurotransmitters to stimulate the branch-like endings of a neuron called dendrites. These dendrites, in turn, stimulate the cell body. Then that stimulates the axon and the axon endings. These axon endings send neurotransmitters to the dendrites of adjacent neurons. Neurons operate in only one direction, from dendrite to cell body to axon, and ultimately the axon endings. It's also important to remember that one neuron is not just connected to one other neuron. And in fact, some neurons in your brain may have connections to at least 1,000 other neurons. And so it's a system of connections, not just really a string of lights. And it's important because that's how we get an explanation of how fast we can process information in the brain. Information processing, in fact, is one of the things that our brain does best. It's essential that we just not record sensory information coming in, but to make sense of it, and that requires a coordinated effort on many parts of the brain. Neurobiologists and other investigators understand that humans and animals operate similarly when processing information. The brain uses many parts of the brain to make sense of the incoming sensory data and understand the meaning of what it is they're seeing, hearing, touching, smelling, etc. This shows you that among mammals, starting from rats, cats, chimpanzees, and humans, that the very parts of the brain that perform similar functions are very similar across these mammalian species. And all of these parts of the brain are heavily involved in information processing. There are exceptions, of course, but fortunately, very few. Before we think exclusively about ourselves as a bunch of neurons, It's important to remember that we really don't know quite how it all fits together yet. And so it's better to think of ourselves as a bio-psycho-social system. In fact, you can build up from the cellular level that we've been talking about. We are more than just a bunch of interconnected neurons, but it's a place to start. We know that these interconnected neurons have organs such as the brain. And so you could study individuals and animals at the organ level of the brain. We also systematically process information. So we can also study ourselves at the system level. What is the visual system, for example? We also know that there is a sense of self at the individual level. And this is the level of the human being, the person, if you will. We grow up in families, and the families have a profound influence on our behavior and our thinking. And then ultimately, we may belong to an ethnic group, and this is where we pick up our cultural ideas. And then finally, of course, we're part of a much larger community, which we call society. All of these levels are very legitimate areas of investigation for a psychologist or a social psychologist or related fields. And until we actually understand how they all fit together, we're never really going to be just somebody studying individual neurons and understanding the complete person.